Hello, everyone. First of all, welcome to the sixth seminar of research. So welcome everyone to the sixth seminar of the dialogues on philosophy and technology. My name is Yuk Hui, so welcome everyone. And we already have 5 seminars, and you are able to find the recordings on YouTube of this seminar series. And today is my great pleasure to welcome Henning Schmidgen to intervene in this seminar. Henning Schmidgen is currently a professor of media studies at the Bauhaus University in Weimar in Germany, and with whom I also worked briefly in Weimar in 2019. He studied psychology, philosophy, and linguistics in Berlin and in Paris, and in 1996 he obtained his PhD in psychology at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and from 1997 to 2011, he worked at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science at the Department of Hans-Georg Reiberger in Berlin. And in 2011, he obtained his habilitation in History of Science and Media Studies. And he was called to be the professor of media aesthetics at the University of Regensburg between 2011 and 2014. Henning has published a lot on the history of science and media studies, and he worked extensively on Guattari's machines, Canguilhem's concepts and problem of time in physiology, psychology, and psychoanalysis. His research is published by journals such as ISIS, Configurations, Grey Rooms, and so on. Among his recent books are The Helmholtz Curves, Tracing Lost Time, in English, published in 2014, The Guattari Tapes, 2019, and more recently, Horn, or The Counterside of Media, recently published, and it is a book on the work of the artist Rebecca Horn. But these are the English translations of his books in German, and there are still quite some books that are not yet translated. And today he's going to give a seminar titled Machinic Normativity, a subject that is closely related to his reading of Canguilhem, of Georges Canguilhem and Gilles Deleuze. So thank you very much, Henning, for accepting to participate. And after Henning's talk, we are going to have a dialogue and followed with questions from the audience. So thank you, Henning.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yuk, for this very kind introduction. Hello, everybody from Weimar in Germany. I hope you can see and hear me clearly. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm flattered to be invited to this series with such prestigious colleagues, and really look forward to the dialogue with you, but also to the discussion with the audience. Yeah, I start right away with the talk. As has been announced, will deal with what I call machinic normativity. And my introduction brings together 2 people that are not usually considered together, namely Alfred Rethel, who is a theoretician from the Frankfurt School, from the larger context of the Frankfurt School, and Jakob von Uexküll, the theoretician, physiologist of the environment, of the Umweltlehre. And I start with a quote from Soren Rethel, which says, in Naples, technical devices are, as a rule, broken down. It is only under exceptional circumstances and due to some astonishing accident that something will be found to be intact. With these sentences begins Alfred Sohn Rethel's by now legendary text on Neapolitan technology. First published in 1926 in the Frankfurter Zeitung, Sohn Rethel, under the title The Ideal of the Broken Down, describes Naples as a city in which door handles, and I quote, appear to be among the mythical entities, and in which doors are, quote again, only there to be left open. Littré and Lacan would certainly not have felt at home there, one might add, since they both deemed that a door should be either open or shut. But Bruno Latour and Gilbert Simondon, perhaps, who both had a different notion of doors, might have liked the city described by Alfred Sohn Rethel. Sohn Rethel, however, is not just concerned with doors in this short text. He does not want to discuss the ideal of the broken down exclusively with a view to such comparatively simple technical objects, but above all in relation to, and I quote again, truly mechanical devices and other such like appliances. What he means are cars that don't move, railroad trains that are delayed or don't come at all, an electricity supply that fails again and again without notice, or a telephone network in which the numbers go their own ways if they haven't been forgotten altogether by the operator. Sohn Rethel also cites other, less infrastructurally oriented examples. They interest us here because they concern the subjective and, in this sense, normative handling of technical objects. For example, the driver of a motorboat is mentioned, who drives out to the stormy sea with his passengers without hesitation, but only seems to notice that the petrol canister is defective at the moment when he has already come dangerously close to a cliff. But for the Neapolitan, as Sohn Rethel stereotypically puts it, this is no problem. On the contrary, I quote, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he, the boat driver, manages to drain and refill the canister in the middle of wild waves without stopping the engines, while at the same time preparing coffee for his passengers on the hot machine. In Naples, technical devices take the most extraordinary diversions, our author observes, visibly impressed, and cites as another example an engine, and I quote, liberated from the constraints of some smashed up motorbike and then used in a latteria to whip cream. Sohn Rethel also refers to all those pieces of wood and rags picked up from the street or pulled from a trouser pocket to provisionally repair a car's defective engine, because he, that is a Neapolitan, and I quote again, detests the very notion of lasting repairs and would rather do without a car altogether. So Rethel's description captivates with a calculated transgression of the notion, which at least in our country exists until today, that there is a specifically Southern talent for improvisation, which is combined with a good portion of artful self-performance. The sociologist from the North is concerned with the actual mastery that is expressed in the Neapolitan handling of technology, with a tinkering proficiency always characterized as it is by the great presence of consciousness that is evident in the idiosyncratic use of technical objects, with the embedding of the machines in a, as he puts it, vital ground, a Lebensgrund, that is completely foreign to them, with effects that are as surprising as they are convincing. Sohn-Rethel specifies this perspective. The Neapolitan use of technology transforms not the tool, but the machine into an embodied instrument. It turns it into a truly incorporated possession, as he puts it, and thus destroys the misanthropic magic of intact mechanical functions. The ideal of the broken down thus stands for the seemingly paradoxical figure of a technophile, a lover of technology, an amateur, as Latour might put it, a technophile resistance to the prevailing form of technology. Today, I would like to relate this idea to Felix Guattari's understanding of the machinic, that is, of machines and of machinism. Indeed, one thinks to hear a clear echo of Sohn-Rethel's text when Guattari states in the early 1970s in Anti-Oedipus, written together with Gilles Deleuze, and I quote from Guattari, "Desiring machines work only when they break down and by continually breaking down," end of quote. And although the two authors were unaware of the essay on the ideal of the broken down, they add, and I quote again from Deleuze and Guattari, "Hence we are all handymen," or as the original says, bricoleurs, that is tinkerers, each with his little machines. Now, it's well known that Felix Guattari at no point simply defined what he understood by machine or machinic. For matters of orientation, I would therefore like to point to two layers of meaning in advance. The first derives from the literal meaning of machinisme in French, an expression that stands for machine beings in general, but in particular for machine construction. As discourse on the bricoleur suggests, machinic refers to all that concerns the active process of building machines, even if, and especially if, the focus is not on the scientific knowledge of the engineer, but on the intuitive and local knowledge of the handyman. As we shall see, this ability to build machines, tools, and things is an almost existential theme for Guattari. The second layer of meaning arises from the fact that machinisme has come to be used in French as a translation for a term coined and used by Karl Marx in the Capital, namely the term machinery. Especially in the fourth section of his critique of political economy, Marx describes how the contemporary regime of large-scale industry emerged from the development of guilds, manufacturers, and factories. In this context, Marx pays particular attention to the interaction of workers and tools or machines, the production of relative surplus value that can be observed in this process, and the conflicts and struggles that result from it. Cannot go into details here. What is important for us is simply the point that machinery and or machinism in this context does not refer exclusively to technology, but always means the interactions of workers and technology, of man and machine, of entities that Marx describes in an almost symmetrical way as the conscious and unconscious organs of the developed factory body. This perspective of the interaction of humans and machines is taken up again by Guattari in his concept of the machinic. Now, before we go into this in more detail, let's now briefly turn to the other aspect of my topic and to the other half of my title, namely normativity. This aspect too can be explained with reference to a scientific visitor to Naples who, a few years after Sohn-Rethel, equally commented the peculiarities of Neapolitan technology. The person in question is none other than the environmental physiologist Jakob von Uexküll, who pursued his research on marine organisms every year since the 1910s at the Stazione Zoologica in Naples. In his autobiographical notes from the 1930s, again in a cliche-like discourse, von Uexküll points to the fact that the Neapolitans faced the machine age with considerable reserves. And I quote from von Uexküll, The admiration of machines, as is now common in Europe and especially in America, they find simply ridiculous. End of quote. Then the physiologist describes the particular use made of technology in Naples in a similar way to his own Rachel, although from a different perspective. And I quote, "For the Neapolitan, even the greatest machine is nothing but a more or less useful tool for particular human beings," end of quote. If one reads against the background of these statements, von Uexküll's unsystematic but nevertheless programmatic remarks about technology, which can be found in his scientific writings, one will not be able to deny them a certain similarity to von Rachel's position. Thus, in the preface to his foray into the worlds of animals and humans, large and complicated machines are for their part presented as tools. Contrary to the common view, according to von Uexküll, the tool is in fact a class, and I quote, "to which all large machines belong, such as those in our factories that process natural products, and furthermore, all trains, automobiles, and aircraft," end of quote. As is well known, from this group of machine tools, he then distinguishes those technological objects, which he calls perception tools, or Merkzeuge, that is telescopes, eyeglasses, microphones, radio devices, and so on and so forth. For the question of normativity, however, it is not this distinction that is the decisive one, that is the distinction between machines on the one hand and media on the other. The crucial point here is the emphasis on the subject that goes along with it, the subject which makes use of these tools and which does, as von Uexküll says, and I quote him, "affects and perceives with them." The machine theory of the living, which reduces all life to a kind of blind mechanism, overlooks, he criticizes, this very subject. It sees in the animal or in the human being simply a mechanical assemblage without also discovering the machine operator who is built into the organs just as we are into our bodies, end of quote. However, according to von Uexküll, it is only through the consideration of this machine subject that the facts of the environment are revealed. And I quote again, "For everything a subject perceives belongs to its perception world, to its Merkwelt, and everything it produces to its effect world, to its Wirkwelt. And further, Merkwelt and Wirkwelt together form one closed unit, the environment, die Umwelt." This would be then exactly the second aspect of my title. Normativity, as understood here, refers to the ability of organic individuals to independently define the norms that are crucial for their living existence. One could also say for their healthy existence. These norms, as the great von Uexküll reader Georges Canguilhem adds, exist because living subjects do not simply adapt to an environment, but first and foremost create it in the sense of a specific environment, which in the case of humans happens to a considerable extent through and with machines and media, that is, via Wirk- and Merkzeuge. As a footnote to this point, I would like to add that Canguilhem's interest in environmental theory or Umweltlehre was influenced not only by von Uexküll, but to an even greater extent by Kurt Goldstein in the early 1940s. I will come back to this a little later. However, we should note that already in the 1930s, Canguilhem's interest in the problem of the environment was stimulated by a rather intensive engagement with Marxist philosophy and a related questioning of the problem of technology. Indeed, during the 1930s, in particular facing the rise of fascism, Canguilhem assumed that the biological as well as technological ability to shape one's environment is precisely what is at the core of historical materialism. This then would finalize the introduction of the argument I would like to present and discuss today. The argument is Guattari's understanding of technology from the early writings on psychoanalysis and transversality to the late vision of a post-media age, is shaped by a biomedical as well as sociological conception, which can be traced back to the vital Marxism of Georges Canguilhem and Kurt Goldstein. As we shall see, this understanding of technology is mediated through the psychiatric writings of Yuk Hui, the founder of the Laborde clinic where Guattari used to work almost all of his life. I argue that it is this context and this tradition that allows Guattari to grasp the relationship between subjectivity and technology as a positive and largely open one, far removed from any technology or media determinism and any philosophy of technology as our fate or Geschick. With Guattari, we return to a critical understanding of technology as a productive force. My talk is sort of divided in 4 sections. The first one is called magnetophone, film typewriter. And it obviously is not only about Guattari, but also takes issue with Friedrich Kittler's media determinism. So to bolster the claim that I just made, I would like to characterize in the first step Guattari's understanding of an approach to technology by recalling a case history from his psychiatric practice. In the early 1950s at Laborde Clinic, the young Guattari treated a young male psychotic whose name he abbreviates as R.A. Uri and Guattari had encountered many difficulties integrating R.A. in the ergotherapeutic treatment regimen of Laborde. The concrete behavior of the patient was characterized by his systematic opposition to the way the clinic operated. When he was addressed, R.A. made stereotypical dismissive remarks, which were aggressive to a greater or lesser degree, and his other behavior was generally marked by passivity and rejection. Every now and then, R.A. withdrew to his room, lay rigid on the bed, would not say a word, etc., etc. Guattari's therapeutic interventions aimed at a symbolic restructuring of the patient. In this, he followed a program using the same formulation which is found in Jacques Lacan's seminars of this period that Guattari attended. In this perspective, the psychotic state is seen essentially as a disorder of the symbolic function. As a matter of fact, R.A. only rarely made coherent and hardly elaborate utterances. During his systematic opposition, he mainly repeated the fragment, "Mom, my meal," a signifying chain that appeared like the condensed formula of his psychotic singularity. In practical terms, however, Guattari clearly went beyond the framework provided by Lacanian psychoanalysis. Together with Uri, he decided that his analytic dialogue with R.A. would take place in the presence of a tape recorder. The tape recorder was not used to record therapy sessions for the purpose of documenting or subsequently analyzing them. Guattari only turned the machine on when the therapeutic dialogue faltered, became frayed, or when R.A. again became overtly dismissive and hostile. The decisive factor was the symbolic function of the tape recorder. I quote from Guattari, "It was then as if a third person had appeared in the room. The two bodies, psychology, and the associated perspectives of the imaginary disappeared," end of quote. Guattari did not only use a tape recorder, however. Cinematography also played a role in his treatment. Thus, Guattari tells us that R.A. recognized himself during the screening of film recordings that had been made from a group of patients within the clinic, possibly as part of the cinematographic atelier that Guattari offered together with René Laloux, who later became famous with his animation movies. Both the tape and the film, according to Guattari, contributed to R.A.'s going through a kind of mirror stage after a few weeks, in which, and I quote from Guattari, "looking into the mirror, he, R.A., scanned his face and found his way back to a kind of jubilant self-awareness of the kind Lacan describes in his essay, The Mirror Stage as a Shaper of the Ego Function. Let us note that the register of the imaginary is not simple, but twofold, captured through two kinds of media here, audio recordings and films. This was only the first step, however. In order to structure the function of the symbolic, Guattari invited R.A. to begin with copying a book, namely Kafka's novel, The Castle. Through the directed activity of copying, emphasis was placed not on subjective linguistic expression, but on the form of the activity itself, its technique, if you like. In a further step, the tape recordings were successively replaced by a notebook, a kind of therapy diary. At first, this notebook was kept by the analyst and after each session, giving to R.A. Eventually, the patient himself began to continue writing in the notebook, to elaborate the entries and finally even to type them. Let us note here that the register of the symbolic is not only attached to the typewriter, as it would be in Kittler, but also to the handwriting, the writing of the diary and the copying of the novel. In the following, Guattari shows how R.A. begins to expand his symbolic capacities beyond the realm of the therapeutic dialogue. He starts to write letters to his parents, and he further devotes himself to elaborating his diary notes, which he now makes available to an extended readership. R.A. writes about himself and discusses what he has written with the others who are in the clinic. Guattari comments, and I quote, "He, R.A., has acquired a symbolic personality to which he stands, which changes the meaning of his illness," end of quote. Now, it is important to see that the media therapy practiced by Guattari is not due to any idiosyncratic affection for machines, but neither does it owe itself to pure chance. Rather, this use of technology fits into the totality of therapeutic practices that have been cultivated at Laborde Clinic since it opened in the early 1950s. An important feature of the clinic's operation was to include all patients, or pensionnaires, as they were and are called, in the routines of everyday work. Inspired by the German psychiatrist Hermann Simon and his concept of a more active treatment of the mentally ill, the clinic's founder, Jean Hui, was convinced that it was essential for the pensionnaires to be involved in the work that needed to be done in the kitchen, the administration, in workshops and other areas of the clinic. This included, for example, operating the telephone switchboard and driving shuttle cars between the clinic, which is located in the countryside, and the nearest train station in the city of Blois. In addition, artistic activities in the broadest sense were an important aspect of everyday life at Laborde. The patients were offered work groups for painting and drawing, a studio for puppets, and a typewriting studio. Each year, they also prepared a theater play, which was always performed on a specific day in August at the clinic in front of an invited audience and guests from the surrounding area. These theatrical performances lasted all day, punctuated by extended breaks, conversations with the audience, and communal meals, and of course, by unforeseen events during the performance itself. If you would like to learn more about it, I highly recommend a film from the early 1990s done by Nicolas Philibert, which is called, the French title is La Moindre des Choses. I think there is a translated version available on YouTube. Now, these artistic practices were always related to media technologies. A particularly striking example of this is the animated film Les Dents du Singe, made in the late 1950s under the guidance of Guattari, Uri, and René Laloux by the patients at Laborde. I think this film is also available on YouTube, and I also recommend it highly. It's a 10-minute animation in color that has a black and white introduction where you also see the young Guattari and the filmmaker and their work together with the patients. In other words, Guattari's use of magnetophone or tape recording, film, and typewriter as important components of the therapeutic, psychotherapeutic process was embedded in a context saturated with a creative media culture that served the overarching purpose of reappropriating subjectivity, or as Guattari would later put it, of producing subjectivity. In other words, this media culture was imbued with what I call machinic normativity. Okay, here's the next section of my talk where I step back a little and tell you something about the context in which Guattari's work, therapeutic work, is to be seen, namely the tradition of institutional therapy. Guattari's therapeutic approach has to be understood within the context of this psychiatric work of Jean Hui, the aforementioned founder and medical director of Laborde. Uri completed his psychiatric apprenticeship years in the legendary clinic of Saint-Alban in the Lozère, the actual starting point of the movement of the so-called institutional psychotherapy. In 1950, Uri completed the training he received there with François Tosquelles by means of a doctoral thesis on the connection between art and madness. At least since the beginning of his work at Saint-Alban in 1947, Uri was interested in the potentially therapeutic aspect of artistic practices. The specific subject of his medical doctoral thesis was the, and I quote, aesthetic imaginary as a factor in biopsychological integration. And in several essays, some of which appeared in Jean Dubuffet's Cahiers de l'Art Brut, Uri presented clinical case studies that straddled the lines between madness and art. You will perhaps remember that Claude Lévi-Strauss, when he contrasted the type of the tinkerer or bricoleur with that of the engineer in his book on the savage mind, refers to Jean Dubuffet and the Art Brut movement. But already Uri, who was in close contact with Dubuffet in the early 50s, described in his doctoral thesis the figure of the tinkerer who is as idiosyncratic as he is self-determined or autonomous. Hence, the reappearance of the bricoleur in Anti-Oedipus in 1972. Following Hans Prinzhorn, Walter Morgenthaler, and comparable authors, Uri insists on the vital, perhaps one should say vitalist, connections between the experience of psychosis and artistic creation, and I quote, "Works of art are always failures," he points out. For example, traces, imprints, recordings of a failure of oneself. Nevertheless, they are necessary structures of approaching, of coming closer. The aesthetic conatus is a vital intentional function, end of quote. As an illustration of the view of the artistic processes alluded to here, let us refer to the description given by Uri in 1956 in the art magazine Bizarre of one of his patients who was a sculptor. I don't have any images here, but I guess you're skilled enough to look this up in the internet. The artist who is in question here is named Auguste Forestier, and he's part of the Art Brut movement initiated by Dubuffet. And I recommend that you look up some of the objects done by Auguste Forestier. Here is what Uri writes about him. Auguste Faure, as he calls him, has no preconceived ideas. He lifts up, he builds, he constructs himself. He makes no artistic effort to transfer a symbolic scheme into the world of things. He is himself a symbolic scheme. He has passed through the mirror. He constructs himself with old pieces of wood, scrap iron, pieces of rubber, broken glass, trouser buttons, and old coins. It would be quite mistaken and useless to try to describe the man on one side and the work on the other. He is human and work at the same time. The thing in itself no longer exists. There is no longer an isolated object, no object in itself. Every object becomes an organic part of a whole. even the totality quickly loses its ordinary representative value. It must be conceived as a comprehensive analog of a life, the life of Forestier, end of quote. Yeah, so please have a look at the sculptures done by Forestier, and you will immediately grasp the sort of the bricoleur aspect of his work. Hui's account is not just to be understood as a background for the later descriptions of the schizophrenic as the paradigmatic tinkerer in Anti-Oedipus. It is also to be seen as a necessary complement to Guattari's case history concerning RA. The analyst's creative use of technology corresponds to the no less creative use of techniques that can be observed in the case of For. What we are dealing here with is a constructivism referring to and transforming both sides, the subject and the object, a shaping of the environment that at the same time forms an organism. This point can be grasped more precisely when we now briefly turn to Georges Canguilhem and Kurt Goldstein. In fact, Hui refers to both Canguilhem and Goldstein in order to support his understanding of the creative autonomy of organic individuals. Okay, I turn now to a section that I titled Technology and Normativity. Now, depicting Canguilhem as a philosopher of technology is somewhat unusual, to say the least. As already pointed out, he's mostly read as a philosopher and historian of the biomedical sciences. Against this standard view, I'd like to argue that technology was a central topic of Canguilhem's work, a topic that even then did not lose any of its importance to him when he had established himself as a historical epistemologist in Paris in the mid-1950s. In fact, technology is something like a red thread of his somewhat twisted academic career. In his early work, Canguilhem's discussion of technology starts with a discussion of René Descartes' philosophy. This may seem as a disappointing French commonplace. However, the way in which Canguilhem reads Descartes since the 1930s is rather interesting and even startling. It contrasts in significant ways with established traditions of Descartes scholarship. In 1937, at the occasion of the 9th International Congress of Philosophy in Paris, Canguilhem impressed his audience by proceeding in a fashion that today we would probably qualify as a technological reading of Descartes, technological reading in the sense of Peter Garrison. In his article, Descartes et la technique, Canguilhem confronts us with Descartes as being not just a philosophical author, but at the same time as being a physician, an engineer, and an optician. The reason for suggesting this perspective is simple. Canguilhem refers the publications and letters by Descartes not exclusively to other texts, but at the same time to the, as I would call it, material culture in which the philosopher of the cogito lived, and for which he interested himself in detailed and practical ways. For example, the hydraulic contrivances in the beautiful park of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the trajectories of cannonballs, the acoustical properties of chimes, and so on and so forth. By reading Descartes in such a manner, Canguilhem attributes technology a position or function that in phenomenology would be filled by what is so aptly called the life world, die Lebenswelt. The term Canguilhem actually uses is genre de vie, so form of life, or I think form of life would be the best translation. Genre de vie, a term he derives from Maurice Halbwachs and Lucien Febvre. In other words, from the very beginning, Canguilhem closely relates technology and life to one another. For example, when underscoring that Descartes, by means of his technological practice, is connected to life, as he puts it. Canguilhem argues that technology in its very artificiality represents for Descartes a quote-unquote natural world, which impacts on his perception of and practical engagement with phenomena and processes. Canguilhem adds that Descartes suggests that the failures of technology, its breaking down, or in other words, the resistances that human skills encounter push human thought to, and I quote Canguilhem, to consider the obstacle as an object that is independent of human wishes. This conception of technology as being closely tied to life is confirmed and further developed in Canguilhem's doctoral thesis in medicine, his famous essay on some problems concerning the normal and the pathological in 1943. From the first page, Canguilhem makes sure that this essay is not restricted to reflecting the theoretical status of such concepts as illness and health, norm and average. As he states in the introduction, the essay has to be taken also and above all a consideration concerning the relation of science and technology. Similar to his article on Descartes, Canguilhem refers back in this connection to a rather classical understanding of technology. In his eyes, medicine is, and I quote, a technique or art at the crossroads of several sciences, rather than, strictly speaking, one science, end of quote. In other words, he bases his notion of technology on an Aristotelian understanding of techne as a mode of action that implies specific skills, abilities, and knowledge. In contrast, the notion that technology is the material totality of tools and apparatuses, so of things, recedes to the background. This understanding of technology is repeatedly confirmed in the course of the essay. For example, when Canguilhem calls medicine an art of living, or when he describes it as imbued with a rashness that tends to be unmindful of the obstacles to be encountered, whereas science progresses with the prudence of codified knowledge. The purpose of conceiving of medicine as a technique in this sense is to contribute to a concretization of philosophy that here again recalls phenomenology, but also the philosophy of Marx. When Canguilhem speaks of technique and or technology, he tries to adopt a philosophical point of view, allowing to grasp the activity of organic individuals, such as humans, in concrete ways, that is, in ways that illustrates the fact, as he puts it, that, and I quote, the qualified living being lives in a world of qualified objects. Corresponding to these claims, technology appears as a continuation of vital impulses. I quote again, all human technique, including that of life, is set within life, that is, within an activity of information and assimilation of material. Now, if medicine is situated and understood in this way, it becomes rather obvious that physiology, as the paradigmatic medical science, is not just a kind of institution relying on the prudence of codified knowledge. More precisely, it comes second after technique. As Canguilhem points out, it is technology that functions as, and I quote, the advisor and animator of scientific research, directing attention to concrete problems. And here again, the obstacles that human art or technique encounters are decisive factors in stimulating scientific thought and action. This also explains why technique is far from being a simple application of pre-existing scientific knowledge, a point that Canguilhem insists on. He attributes technique, and I quote, a value of its own, and I quote, and returns in this connection to the close relation between life and technology. According to him, life in itself is, and I quote, activity of information and assimilation. It is the root of all technical activity, end of quote. Differently put, medicine is a technique insofar as it is, I quote again, rooted in the living being's spontaneous effort to dominate the environment and organize it according to his values as a living being. Now, please note that through the notion of environment, we are connected here again to von Uexküll as well as to Marx, as previously pointed out. In his articles from the 1940s and 50s, Canguilhem further develops his notion of techne. Following up on the sociological studies of industrial labor carried out by Marxist philosopher Georges Friedman, Canguilhem strives for using his understanding of technology to defend the values of living beings against the reigning values of contemporary society. In this connection, he criticizes orthodox communism, for example, for restricting itself to envisioning a simple redistribution of the means of production instead of attempting to remodel the vital relation between human bodies and machines. In addition, Canguilhem develops a perspective on technological things and apparatuses, or in other words, the material culture of technology that is characterized by doing away with ontological distinctions between the interior organs of the human body and the externalized apparatuses of current technology. In his famous article on machine and organism, he bluntly states in 1952, and I quote, "A tool or a machine is an organ, and organs are tools or machines," end of quote. In this article, an organological perspective on technology, a renewed reading of Descartes, and a number of arguments with respect to the history of science lead up to a programmatic distinction between technology and science. Quote, "Science and technique must be considered not as two types of activity, one of which is grafted onto the other, but as two types of activity, each of which borrows from the other, sometimes its solutions, sometimes its problems," end of quote. And Canguilhem adds, "The rationalization of techniques makes us forget the irrational origin of machines." This programmatic distinction between science and technology is representative of Canguilhem's thought up until the 1990s. Now, in the essay, however, reference is made not only to von Uexküll, but also to Kurt Goldstein. In fact, Goldstein's notion of medical action aims in a very similar direction as Canguilhem's understanding of technique. Indeed, when Canguilhem says, and I quote, "Man is healthy insofar as he is normative relative to the fluctuations of his environment," this sentence is understood against the background of an intensive reading of Goldstein's principal work, The Structure of the Organism. In this book, Goldstein repeatedly emphasizes the environmental character of human action. For instance, when he declares that, and I quote, "To maintain health means to avoid abnormal reactions in spite of defects by changing the milieu or by finding a new adequate milieu." Medical action, that is technical action in the sense of Canguilhem, is therefore above all the reconstruction of a milieu, the construction of milieus, as Goldstein puts it, or at least the finding of a new suitable milieu for the patient, which will enable him or her to exist in his or her specific ways. With Goldstein, one could further explain that this does not simply impose something artificial, constructed on the sick person, but rather connects to an intrinsic ability of the patient, insofar as the patient is able, and I quote again, "by virtue of nature, to freely create situations for himself that secure his life, his existence," end of quote. In other words, the entire endeavor of the tradition of institutional psychotherapy, which consists in establishing and maintaining an adequate environment for the mentally ill, seems to me to be summed up here. And as we shall see, this is probably no accident, for Canguilhem was quite familiar with this psychiatric context. But before we turn to this point in more detail, Canguilhem actually spent some time in the clinic of Saint-Alban, where Uri also was working at a later point in time. And before we turn to this, let me add a few things concerning Deleuze and the question of technology. At first glance, it seems that Deleuze's interest in technology as a philosophical topic was only stimulated when he started collaborating with Guattari in the early 1970s. In fact, it was Guattari, as Deleuze himself underscored, who coined and created the infamous concept of desiring machines, and also, notions of the machinic and machinism. In addition, one should note that the beginning of their co-authorship is marked by an essay that Guattari wrote with respect to Deleuze's book on the logic of sense in 1969, This article by Guattari, titled Machine and Structure, clearly indicates the direction in which both should be working together, that is, getting away from the structuralism that dominated both psychoanalysis and Marxism, or simply put, getting rid of Lacan and Althusser, in order to invent a new constructivist conception of the societal unconscious centered around the concepts of machine and machinism. Now, in my very early work on the unconscious of machines, I argued in favor of this version of the events by highlighting the fact that the term machine surfaces in Deleuze's writings in significant ways only after he started his collaboration with Guattari. More precisely, I refer to Deleuze's extended article on the literary machine, published in 1970 in the second edition of Proust and Science. This article is also the first in which Deleuze explicitly refers to the work of Guattari. However, in this context, machine is not exactly a term relating to the philosophy of technology. Deleuze makes use of this expression in order to describe the enormous novel by Marcel Proust, À la recherche du temps perdu, and modern literature in general as a construction and operation of machines that are able to create artistic truth. From this perspective, the literary work does not pose any longer any problems of meaning and/or representation. You are all familiar with this. It only poses a problem of usage. I quote from Deleuze, there is nothing to explain, nothing to understand, nothing to construe. It is a kind of electric plugging in. In addition, one should recall that in Deleuze's writings before Anti-Oedipus, there is a different kind of model dominating. Before starting his collaboration with Guattari, Deleuze derives the most impressive and convincing models for his philosophy, not from technology, but from the world of the theater. This holds true for his interest in a typology of philosophers that he adopts from Hume and Nietzsche, and more generally, it holds true for the method of dramatization. However, even insofar as Deleuze programmatically advocates indifference and repetition, a thinking without images, it presents itself with Artaud as a theater of repetition that is affected by pure forces and dynamic traces in space that impact on the mind without any mediation. Now, if we re-examine today the totality of Deleuze's writings, we will come up with a somewhat different picture. What one realizes today is that Deleuze addressed the problem of technology comparatively early and explicitly, and for us in a very interesting way. It is true that Deleuze never was a student of Canguilhem's. However, in 1955, Deleuze and Canguilhem briefly cooperated. By then, Canguilhem had established a book series titled Textes et Documents Philosophiques, and Deleuze acted as an editor of one of the first volumes in that series, titled Instincts and Institutions. Now, one of the sections of this volume is explicitly devoted to technology, and this is the point that is interesting to us in this context. In this section, Deleuze presents 5 texts and excerpts from Samuel Butler's novel Erewhon that will resurface in Anti-Oedipus several years later, a passage from an article by Claude Lévi-Strauss on the history and ethnology, which unfortunately does not deal with the problem of bricolage, but still is interesting. A fragment from the book of female biologist André Tétry on tool use in the animal kingdom. Tétry is also often quoted by Simondon at about the same time. Then an excerpt from Creative Evolution, in which Bergson discusses the relation between instinct and tool use. And finally, a passage concerning problem solving taken from Wolfgang Köhler's book on the mentality of apes. Now, it's obviously almost impossible to deduce from this collection of short texts anything like a concrete position of Deleuze with respect to the philosophy of technology. However, what we can observe is that the choice of these texts is clearly aiming at a biological theory of technology, and at the same time follows the directions that Canguilhem had given in his writings, in particular his 1952 book, Knowledge of Life, where this famous article, Machine and Organism, is also included. In addition to this sort of observation, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Deleuze reviewed Michel Foucault's book on the French writer Raymond Roussel in 1963. In this review, Deleuze repeatedly refers to the extraordinary machines that Roussel describes in his novels, and that, according to Foucault, are amazing repetition machines, machines that, properly speaking, tend to hide what they reproduce instead of showing it. Now, in Roussel's serial machines, Foucault recognized more or less clear illustrations of the famous procedure that the writer applied, that Roussel applied for writing his novels. As is well known, he always started off from two sentences or phrases that were almost identical on the phonetic level while transporting radically different meanings. Roussel then filled the distance between the two meanings with descriptions of strange spectacles, virtuous performances, and complex machineries, or as Foucault puts it in his book, and I quote, "Repetition is looked for and found only by starting from this minimal difference of meaning that paradoxically induces the identity of language." Now, as a consequence, it almost sounds as if anticipating on the central topic of Deleuze's most important book, Difference and Repetition, when Deleuze, in his review of Foucault's book, observes that Roussel fills the gap of language, and I quote, "with a whole machinery that binds the differences to and integrates them with repetition," end of quote. In other words, via Foucault, Deleuze was familiar with Roussel's spatula machines long before they should resurface in Anti-Oedipus. To sum up, then, we can say that Deleuze dealt with the question concerning technology before he started to collaborate with Guattari, and he did so in rather original ways. On the one side, by drawing on a biology of technology, a technological vitalism that, just like in Canguilhem, stresses the continuities between life and technology, and on the other side, by being fascinated with the aesthetics of machines that, since the publication of Raymond Roussel's novel, was reoccurring in Dadaism and Surrealism, in particular in Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali, who both referred to and relied on Roussel. Accordingly, the collaboration of Deleuze with Guattari could turn out to be so fruitful, since in his way, Guattari also dealt with the relationship between life, art, and technology, as we have seen. Now, I'm coming to my conclusion, hoping I'm not really running out of time. Excuse me for being long today. I opened this talk by somewhat faking an encounter between Alfred Sohn Rethel and Jakob von Uexküll in Naples. At the end, I will construct a semi-fictitious encounter between Georges Canguilhem and Jean Houry in the psychiatric clinic of Saint-Alban. Houry, as already mentioned, stayed there from 1947 to 1950 to be trained as a psychiatrist, among other things, by collaborating with François Tosquelles. But Canguilhem, and this is the really important and interesting point for us, Canguilhem also knew this clinic from his own experience. Canguilhem stayed there for 2 weeks in the summer of 1944 to hide away from the Nazis as the resistance fighter that he, Canguilhem, was. After the Battle of Montmouchet, Canguilhem had come under attack from the Germans, and with some wounded resistance fighters, he narrowly escaped death. In this situation, the two directors of the Saint-Alban clinic, Tosquelles and Lucien Bonafé, who were not only politically but also artistically committed, offered him shelter. Based on his medical training, the medical training that Canguilhem had, he used his time in the clinic for taking care of some psychiatric patients. So there is actually a notebook that he kept while working at the clinic that has become now published in the context of the Œuvre Complète, edited by Camille Limoges. Canguilhem had just first-hand knowledge of a medical and at the same time political practice for which the question of shaping the environment was of key importance. Now, my argument is that the particular impetus of Guattari's theory of machine and machinism is to be understood against this background. in philosophical but also political terms. Guattari's theory emphasizes the fundamental co-givenness or givenness with of technology in human experience and behavior, as can be found in such a similar way in other contemporary theories. In Donna Haraway's cyborg theory, for example, in Bruno Latour's actor network theory, or if you like, in Heidegger's notion of the Zuhandenheit, readiness at hand. Guattari's emphasis on the machinic and, or the machinic with, continues to be evident in his last book, Cosmosis, when he raises the question, and I quote, should we keep the semiotic productions of the mass media, informatics, telematics, and robotics separate from psychological subjectivity? And I quote, and Guattari then responds, I quote again, I don't think so, just as social machines can be grouped under the general title of collective equipment, technological machines of information and communication operate at the heart of human subjectivity, not only within its memory and intelligence, but within its sensibility, affects, and unconscious phantasmas. End of quote. The crucial point lies in the biological, or if you like, the vitalist foundation of the coupling of body and technology, subjectivity and machine assumed by Guattari. Since his psychotherapeutic work with RA, Guattari has never left any doubt that subjects, individuals, but also collectives, are capable of using technology to create the environment that is specific to them. In one of his last texts, written in 1992, that is before the widespread access to the internet, he states in this sense, and I quote again from Guattari, the interconnection of audiovisual, telematic, and informatic screens could lead to a true revival of collective sensibility and intelligence. The current equation, media equal passivity, may disappear much faster than one thinks. It will all depend on the ability of groups to take hold of these technologies and to appropriate them for specific purposes. It is not technological optimism that speaks from this line, according to me. Rather, they express the conviction that machines and media are vital entities for the subjective exploration and appropriation of reality, a conviction that is of critical interest in times of Google and Facebook. For as with the early Sonretal, for Guattari, technology really begins, to quote once more from the legendary text on the broken down Sonretal, a quote, where man makes use of his veto against the closed and hostile automatism of machines and plunges himself into their world, end of quote. Machinic normativity is not primarily concerned with learning how to handle machines in accordance with existing regulations and norms. On the contrary, it is about discovering and bringing forth in technology one's own body, one's own subjectivity. Therein lies the topicality of Guattari's Neapolitan theory of technology. And let me sort of rephrase this in order to conclude. In my eyes, it is rather crucial to understand Guattari's notion of the machinic not just as descriptive, but also as normative. The important point would then not consist in continuing to study tools, machines, and media as projections and extensions of the human body. This is all important and interesting, but rather we should account for the vitality of our interactions with technological objects in terms of their ability and or disability to allow for creating open and fruitful multiplicities. Or in Canguilhem's words, we should investigate in how far technologies allow and enable us to, and I quote from Canguilhem, to dominate the environment and organize it according to our values as living beings, end of quote, instead of being dominated by technological environments that organize us according to their built-in values. In my eyes, this is the great importance of machinic normativity today. And by this, I conclude and look forward to the dialogue and discussion now. Thank you very much for your attention and for your patience.
Thank you very much, Henning, for this excellent talk. Very interesting, and I mean, for me, it also arouses many questions because it was our plan, I think, two and a half years ago, to have a dialogue on the question of general organology, and well, after 2.5 years it took place, but in between, I didn't really go back. I didn't really have time to go back to the work of Canguilhem, but I think it's a good occasion to that also evoke something that I have been thinking about since a long time. So maybe I wanted to come back to go back to the concept of the machine that is very present already in the title, Machinic Normativity. If we look at the concept of machine that you are describing from the perspective of Canguilhem, maybe we can say that this concept of the machine already implies a general organology, even though you didn't use this term. But if we go to what Canguilhem says about, for example, in Machine and Organism, or in other texts, even in the text on Descartes, for example, especially in Machine and Organism, when he talked about Immanuel Kant, that Canguilhem was also trying to read Immanuel Kant as a philosopher of technology. So like what we try to do to read Canguilhem as a philosopher of technology, well, there Canguilhem want to rejoin tools and machines with the biological, to think about an organology. So in the concept of machine, or in Canguilhem, maybe we can say that, well, the biological basically dominates in a way. The biological dominates, especially maybe later we come back to his reading or his discussion with George Freeman in related to Marx. Where in Guattari, it's the concept of the machine. Even though with Deleuze they use the term designing machine, but it seems to me that the term machine is not a technical concept. It's rather a transversal concept that allow Deleuze and Guattari to think about the assemblage instead of a technical machine, but rather a transversal concept to think about the assemblage of humans, machines, animals, and so on. So that makes it possible to become machine, to become machine, to become animal, for example. So there is a what I'm trying to say is that there is a nuance on maybe we can say in the concept of machine that you are trying to tell us. So if we take this concept of if we try to follow this nuance of the concept of machine, what would be the consequence of thinking about the question of normativity? Because one in Canguilhem we can see it's a very biological. That because that was the term general organology was something when he named Bergson, 1907 creative evolution, as the first work on the general organology. So the biological dominates. Right in Guattari and Deleuze, it seems machine is a quite different concept. So how will this difference, for example, affect the concept of normativity, or for you there is no difference?
Well, there is a difference. I mean, it's quite obvious. That those are, look, I mean, those are different authors and they have different sort of, agendas. That's quite obvious, I would say. But that's sort of the point that I'm trying to make. They're also connected, and I think in very interesting ways. One way, and this only came out more recently. One connection is sort of biographical. It's really the striking fact that Canguilhem was familiar with the psychiatric context, out of which all the work of Guattari and Deleuze eventually came, right? I mean, I think this should also be clear by now that the encounter between Guattari and Deleuze is not the encounter between sort of, two theoretically interested persons. It's the encounter between a philosopher and a political activist and or psychotherapeutic activist, yeah, and sort of psychoanalyst, let's call him that way. It's also important to see Guattari is not a psychiatrist, right? He never had a medical training. Actually, he never got any sort of academic training. That he he didn't have any diplomas. He was there and he did practical work with people that was quite important for this clinical context. And without this sort of access to a, in the widest sense, political practice, we would not have these wonderful books that starting sort of 50 years ago, starting in 1927, 1972, 50 years ago, started with anti-Oedipus and then sort of continued as this corporation. And this, I think, is a sort of if you like, biographical context or background that I think is interesting in the first place, right? And then you can look for sort of more for less tangible convergences and also divergences. And it's obviously that the use that Deleuze and Guattari make of the machine, of the notion of the term of machine, is different from what Canguilhem is doing with the same term, right? I would say the main difference is that Canguilhem has a rather clear conception of what a machine is as a technological object and sort of, how it is defined. He has a very strong argument when it comes to the question of machinic life. And he says, there are no monstrous machines, right? And through him, machines are unable in the sense, because they cannot turn themselves into monsters. There is actually no sort of pathology of machines. This is the reason for Canguilhem to say they are sort of not sort of living entities in themselves. They remain tied to the living entity that is the human being, or eventually might also be sort of animal organisms and tools that they are using. But so you have a sort of very clear, I would say, sort of conception of machines in Canguilhem. I would go so far as to say, although he's familiar with Kant's speculation about the nature of machines, he's not buying into any sort of teleology that might be sort of developed out of machines. He's not. I would, just for the sake of argument, state, he is not on this track. He has a very sort of clear-cut notion of machines as technological objects created by humans. This is perhaps also why there is not really a discussion between Simondon and Canguilhem, which is striking, right? Canguilhem is one of the advisors, one of the mentors to Simondon, but as far as I can see, he never ever makes reference to the book of the mode of existence of technological objects. Whenever he refers to Simondon, he comes up with his work on information and individuation. He's not interested in this highly speculative sort of way of, discussing the life of machines. This is not Canguilhem's main interest, I would say, right? In Deleuze and Guattari, it's different. It is completely obvious. It's also obvious because they replace the sort of the notion of machine after anti-Oedipus by other notions, in particular by the notion of the agencement, right? And there you clearly see that, you know, their main interest, despite their use of the term machine, is not actually in man-machine relations in the sort of conventional sense, but it is rather in those heterogeneous sort of assemblages that work together and that sort of bring out something new. And I would say it's very, you know, it's unfortunate that they are not having more explicit attention for the problem of technology. They do talk about it, but it's not a central concern, I would say. They are more interested in the sort of the overarching context and assemblages in which technology might be one element, but is not sort of, you know, the one sort of crucial element, right?
Right. So yeah, thank you. I think it is also but I mean for sure that different authors, and they also have written about machines in different epochs. They also have different experience with technology at their time. And if we for example look at Canguilhem's text, Machine and Organism, there was a conference he gave in between. Well, he gave 3 conferences in between 1946 and 1947. So Machine and Organism is considered to be a conference of 1947. And that for me is a very special date because, you know, 1948 is the publication of Cybernetics of Norbert Wiener. So Norbert Wiener's work has a really strong influence on the work of Simondon. And the cybernetics was almost everywhere in the, let's say, in the first 2 parts of on the mode of existence of technical object, but not in the 3rd part. The 3rd part was, if you remember the preface of the book, that Simondon thanked Canguilhem specifically for the 3rd part. And well, I heard from Vincent Bontemps that in some of the unpublished, not yet published material, that actually Canguilhem was not happy with the 3rd part. Canguilhem was not happy at all with part 3 of on the mode of existence of technical objects. But in a way, I was thinking about how, you know, cybernetics in the work of Simondon and also in later in Deleuze and Guattari, how that may mark a kind of a difference between their approach to machines and probably machinic normativity when we think together with Canguilhem. Is because I think if I'm correct, when I read Canguilhem, the term machines was very much about tools or about machines that are present in a factory described by Marx. And that is why towards the end of Machine and Organism that he picked up this discussion by George Freeman, who actually proposed a rather strange, interesting proposal to resolve the problem of alienation by by organizing machines according to the rhythm of the organic body. So, because for him, the problem of alienation is that the human body have to be synchronized with the rhythm of machines. Now, if we take the opposite direction, if machines will have to adapt themselves to the rhythm of the organic body of the human being. I mean, not only machines, but also office. He was, as a sociologist, he was also very interested in the environments of the office. So my impression, and that is what I try to say in my book, Reconciliation and Contingency. I have a chapter dedicated to Canguilhem and Bergson, is that in that concept of machine, our Canguilhem's concept of machine, there is still a very limited understanding of machine. Maybe we can say before cybernetics, and there was such a possibility to think in line with George Freeman about a new adaptation of machines according to the rhythm of the human body. But it seems this is no longer the case. For example, in Simondon's work, when machines are becoming organic. Exact phrase from Simondon, that machines are becoming organic, especially after cybernetics, and maybe we can also see it in the writing of Deleuze and Guattari, but I'm not very familiar with that part. But I just have a vague memory that Guattari's discussion with Pierre Lévy when Pierre Lévy was teaching hypertext or something like that at the party read. So if my first question, I point to the difference of the concept of machines in Canguilhem and Guattari and Deleuze. My second question points to the difference of machines that is that divided by cybernetics. On the one hand, we have mechanical machines, tools, and then we have machines that are becoming organic, and maybe that also and how will this affect our thinking about machinic normativity? Because when we think of machines being organic or becoming organic, I mean, machine will never become exactly organic, like what Simondon says, that machines will never be 100% concrete. For example, there's only a concretization of machines. And how it affects with machines being organic or becoming organic? How can we think about the question of normativity? Because it's not the organism that is looking for a healthy configuration, but with a different notion of machines after cybernetics, how could we think about the question of normativity? Well, I hope my question was clear.
Yes, I think I understand what you're gesturing at, and I think it's, this is the crucial question. What happens? To Canguilhem, normativity is really the ability of organic individuals, right? And to him, it was clear, in a sense, that machines are not organic individuals, right? And so the answer to your question for him would be quite easy, right? Normativity remains with the human,
right,
and perhaps with animal beings, right? But I understand that the problem, that the question gets quite complicated if you allow the argument that machines are also and equally organic individuals, right? And I do see that Simondon makes the point that there are technological objects that have to be considered as individuals. And as I said, it's perhaps one of the points where Canguilhem and Simondon really diverge, and where it's really sort of a clear sort of difference there. Now, let me get back to what you said in the beginning when you were referring to the sort of cybernetics and the sort of the year 1947 and in the context of all of this. My sort of, take on this would be that I do not see the importance of cybernetics to Canguilhem at all. I would even say I don't see it. Right? It's absolutely correct and appropriate if you turn our attention to the year of 1947. If you look at the things that Canguilhem is doing in 1947, you will realize he is completely busy with understanding what happened between 1933 and 1945. He is completely busy in understanding the atrocities of the Nazi regime. He is writing obituaries for his colleagues from Strasbourg University who were killed in the German concentration camps. He is writing a quite interesting and important obituary on Maurice Halbwachs, who was killed close to Weimar in Buchenwald concentration camp in 1944. Halbwachs was a member of Strasbourg University, and at that time, Canguilhem still also was a member of Strasbourg University. He taught philosophy there. I would say it's not cybernetics that is important to him. It is really the problem of resistance that is crucial to him. And resistance, not only in the sort of political sense of resist totalitarian regimes and speak up against and speak out against totalitarian regimes, but also in a sort of almost physiological sense, the resistance of the living being against standardization and normalization processes as they are part of sort of modern society. And the example of Friedman in this context is quite pertinent, I would say. And the problem Friedman is addressing is a problem that Canguilhem is actually also interested in. What do we do with the resistances of the human body that we can observe in the factory regime? How are we to understand those resistances, right? So the sickness you can observe in the industrial production sphere, the injuries, the numbness that is created by industrial work, etc. And their position is, to make the long story sort of short, that their suggestion is the solution is not transforming factories into sort of societal property, right? It's not the question to them is not the question of communism. It's not to change private property into sort of societal property. That's not their take on it. They want to change the production process as such, right? And yeah, you can now speculate whether or not this is completely stupid and sort of far-fetched or sort of short-sighted or whatever, or whether it is a sort of appropriate position. To Canguilhem, I think it's only a passing phase, right? His interest in Friedman is high. He's really interested and fascinated by the work that Friedman did. But at the same time, he's only interested in this for a couple of years and then moves on to other questions, in particular the question of science and how science becomes this sort of new rationality that interferes with our lives in general, and how it sort of impacts on our abilities to define how we want to live, and how it impacts on our abilities to resist sort of totalitarian regimes, right? It's not an answer, but that would be my take on what you just sort of brought up, right?
No, I think I completely agree. I mean, that was what I mean, of course, I admire the Canguilhem's participation in the resistance, and I think it's also at this moment that he met. I don't know if he really met, but Toscayes, no, at the
Yeah, he met
salon,
him.
and the point about 1947 that I want to make was simply that it was a very interesting date. I mean, apart from resistance, is also that Canguilhem's reading of machine, also understanding of machine is not cybernetic machine. That was the point I was trying to say, and that was his difference from Simondon's take on the nature of machines. So the Freeman strategy or the Freeman study was also taken up by Simondon. For example, also on the modal existence of technical object, but was Simondon trying to propose to resolve the problem with what he called universal cybernetics. So that's also a quite interesting interesting contrast we can see, and that add also many more questions to the concept of normativity. That was basically my question earlier.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can respond to this really. I'm not able to. I'm not really seeing the sort of the importance of the normativity topic in Simondon. It's true that he's also interested in a philosophy of values. Let's put it that way. So the third part of the mode of existence, I always took as, obviously inspired by what, stuff that would, Canguilhem would do when it comes to continuing what I would say is the core of Canguilhem's philosophy, namely a philosophy of values, right? To be able to distinguish between science on the one side, technology on the other side, art, religion, and these sort of different branches of human expression, and understand them in their specificity. And the third part of mode of existence is clearly sort of motivated by a kind of sort of reference to this old sort of early 20th century version of a philosophy of values, right? But Simondon comes up with this sort of completely schematized view of it, and I guess Canguilhem, I mean, it's really a guess, but my hunch would be that Canguilhem's problem with this is that he's not seeing the role of organic individuals, the role of human beings in this entire model, right? In a sense, Simondon's philosophy in this third part of his technology book is a sort of post-human philosophy. It's sort of structuralist à mon lettre. The human being is not really an actor that is important in this account. And I would say, this is a crucial issue for Canguilhem that in my reading is more and more close actually to philosophy that is more associated with the Frankfurt School, and people who would sort of, highlight the importance of the subject as an instance of resistance, of sort of, activity, of sort of, normativity. And yeah, I would say, it's really, there is a sort of, those are different positions.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true that about the theory of value, and because towards the end, Simondon was mentioning several times about axiology, about the theory of value.
Yeah.
Right. So, well, great. So maybe it's time for us to turn to the question of the audience. I think there's several questions. Can you, if you click on the Q&A, maybe you can you can see them, but I'm going to read anyway because we are streaming, so not.
I see them, but let's read them.
Yeah. So what would be from Victor B3? What would be the role of the notion of dispositive in this framework, given the Deleuzean reading of Foucault and the Canguilhem's influence on Foucault? Would machinic normativity be a way out of the dispositive, or rather there is no way out of the dispositive and the machinic normativity? Allowing for multiplicity would be a dispositive, other, question mark.
Okay. Yeah, the dispositive, that's that would be the other sort of, term that is close to the agencement, to the assemblage in the sense of Deleuze and Guattari, right? There is a Deleuzean reading of Foucault that I think tends to understand Foucault's notion of the dispositive very much along the lines of the assemblage theory, where one could discuss whether or not this is appropriate. I would, when it comes to Canguilhem's influence on Foucault, I would be somewhat cautious because I think it's not really the case that Foucault really was an academic student to Canguilhem. He was not a direct disciple or whatever. You know this from sort of biography that, at the time when Foucault wanted to defend his thesis or started to write his thesis, he was not in Paris, and Canguilhem was not even at the Sorbonne. He only started to be sort of professor there in 1958. So at that time, Foucault had written his book on the history of madness and so on. Yeah, so it's, I don't see a big influence in that sense on Foucault. I don't see how the Canguilhemian notion of machine has impacted on Foucault. I don't see that. What I do see is that there is really a convergence of interest when it comes to the question of resistance, right? And so there is this movie from the 1960s where they discuss philosophy. There is Foucault, there is Canguilhem, there is Ricoeur and others. They are shot for television and they discuss philosophical issues. And there's also Jean Hippolyte in this movie. It's really a fascinating document. And it's one of the rare instances where you can see the interactions between Foucault and Canguilhem, the physical interactions, I mean. And it's quite striking, I would say, to see the young man Foucault standing beside the sort of elderly, already in his mid-50s or so, this Canguilhem, and Foucault is laughing. And it's really striking the way how he laughs, because I think his laughter is so much in accordance with Canguilhem's attitude to philosophy. Yeah, the attitude that is a sort of attitude of autonomy and of incredible smartness and informedness, and I would think that on this level they very much met, and they also met in the sort of in the almost physiological feeling for resistance and the importance of resistance. That in Canguilhem was sort of clear because of his Nazi experience, or the experience of the occupation of France through the Nazis, and that to Foucault was obvious for other reasons, right? And if there is an influence, I would rather say it's a convergence. Then I would say it's on this sort of level that is really very hard to grasp and to nail down. Yeah, it's not really an answer. to the question, but it will be my take to react to this question, right? Would machinic normativity be way out of the dispositive? Yeah, there is no way out of the dispositive, and there is no way out of assemblages. There is no beyond the assemblage or beyond the dispositive. You are always caught in or sort of embedded within a dispositive. Machinic normativity would rather be the ability to define the rules according to which the dispositive is functioning, right? And then if there are sort of technological objects that are part of the dispositive, it will be a question whether or not they offer themselves to define your values and to sort of create and act within the dispositive in ways that are appropriate to you and yours. Yeah, that would be my answer to this. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's another question. How can we form normative value judgment about technology without knowing all the use cases of technology?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. And it's, it's really getting at the core problem of this idea of normative, of machinic normativity, because we will have to talk about the normativity that is built into technology. Guattari is always somewhat quick, I would say, in answering this question. To him, every technological object can be used for everything, right? He was very open to the use of computer technology in the arts. He would say, it's interesting, it can be used for very interesting things. And to him, the crucial aspect was really the use that you make of technology. I would be a little bit more cautious because I do see the restrictions of use built into technologies. And in that sense, the question is really excellent. Yeah, in principle, we would have to know all the use options and use possibilities for every sort of technology before really being able to speak out about their normativity. But in practice, I would say it's really a matter of examples that we have and that we create that show what you can do with technology and what you can't, right? So that would be my sort of answer to this really good question. How can we form normative value judgment about technology? Yeah, it's a really good question. Goes to the heart of the matter. Thanks.
Then we have another one from Mariana Warston. We think the concept of machinic normativity, would you consider connection with the idea of suture, borrowed from Lacanian influence the film theory in relation with contemporary digital tools?
Okay, suture. Yeah, I would have to have time to consider this. I can imagine to consider this, but it's not really the angle from which I'm coming to this topic. I'm very much interested in the question how contemporary digital tools really, what kind of role they play within machinic normativity, right? And that's, I think, perhaps even a crucial question that we had a series of lectures here about digital normativity, right? Is there such a thing as a normativity that is built into digital technologies? And it's really a pressing and interesting question, yeah, because more and more you see that sort of normative definitions enter into the creation of software tools, of algorithms, and so on and so forth. And I absolutely see the need for a critical reflection of this phenomenon. But to be honest, I don't necessarily see it related to the Lacanian notion of the suture.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, but excuse me for being frank here. It's not exactly the angle I'm coming from.
But we have another question. So Henning mentioned, arguing from Canguilhem, that there is no such thing as a pathology of machines by their being intrinsically dissociative of organism. Did I hear it right? I think it is quite clear in Anti-Oedipus, desiring machines are organized by the operations of passive synthesis, and it is only when organic or normative interventions set in, mainly via the illegitimate uses of passive synthesis, that machines become bound to organisms with dangerous consequences. Do you think these illegitimate uses of passive synthesis account for machinic normativity? If so, would this amount to saying that normativity is the cause of the social pathology that arise from the illegitimate uses of these synthesis? The question at the end would be, is there a non-normative treatment of machines?
Yeah, so the first point, yes, you heard right. It's precisely what I was saying. There is I think it's even in the article, Machinic Organism, the rather blunt statement by Canguilhem that there are no pathologies of machines, that there is no monstrous machine. And to Canguilhem, and let's not forget it's 1947 when he's writing this, but to Canguilhem, it's rather clear that there is no normativity in machines. To him, the ability to set the norms that define life and your life, this ability is tied to the existence of organic individuals. And to Canguilhem, this might be higher organisms, but above all, he's thinking there of human beings, right? He's trying to trace down the ability to define those norms up, down onto the most simple forms of life that in the 1940s were discussed. So I'm thinking here of the 1943 in his essay on the pathological and normal. He's referring to the amoeba as the sort of most, of this, as a simple or the most simple organism that is able to draw a distinction between inside and outside. And this, in a sense, is to him a model for normativity, right? Drawing up the boundary between inside and outside and defining yourself by drawing this boundary as an organism. And in Anti-Oedipus, it's different, obviously. This is, also different. You can see this also from the examples they are referring to when they are really discussing biological matters. It's full of molecular biology. And they have a different take on the entire topic because they also consider the existence of machine within the organism, right? And that's not something that you necessarily find in Canguilhem. Canguilhem only got interested in the 1960s in sort of molecular biology. And there are some of his students who claim that he never really was into molecular biology because it's not the kind of biology he was sort of familiar with and interested in. Yeah. And yeah, I'm not so sure about the passive synthesis that you're bringing up here with respect to the desiring machines. There is a lot of, if you look at the examples they're coming up with for desiring machines, it's quite active synthesis that are in question here. It's really sort of more in the line of the example I, for example, quoted from Uri, that Deleuze and Guattari look at artists, for example, who actively engage with their environment, engage with objects and partial objects they encounter in order to create themselves by creating an environment in which they live. And this is not a passive synthesis. This is quite an active process. In insofar, I would say that the question of normativity in Deleuze and Guattari is also sort of, is also posing itself slightly different as in comparison to Canguilhem. It's not a very good answer, but it would be something that I respond to Virgilio Rivas. Thank you for your question.
So thank you. And this we have 2 questions left, and this will be our last 2 questions because we must be tired. We have 1 question from Vincent Puig, who Vincent is the director of the Institute of Research and Innovation in Paris. So we consider taking care of machinic normativity in order to take care of our own normativity. Clinic contributive phase 1, or in order to design new machines, clinic contributive phase 2.
Okay, now I don't know what clinic contributive is really. I apologize for this, but I would be very much in favor of both of the phases that you're describing here. Machinic normativity, so our interaction with technological objects, I think, is crucial for understanding and even also taking care of our own normativity. I don't see the human being as sort of, standing alone, separated from its environment. To the contrary, right? It's embedded, and also it's not only it's embedded in its environment, and it needs the environment to sort of understand what its own normativity is. And depending on the environment, it can discover, various aspects of its own normativity. And at the same time, this very relation also permits and encourages us to design new machines. Absolutely, yeah. Machines that are sort of more open, more fruitful, more heterogeneous than the technological devices that we can buy at Amazon or wherever you buy your cell phones. So both. But obviously, I would be interested to learn about the clinic contributive.
I think that this is actually a project that Erie and before the death of Bernard Stiegler, they were doing with a clinic and in the north of Paris that. But maybe I have mistaken, but it was about, for example, to think about how to resolve the problem of addiction of, for example, certain children when they play video game, when they have a mobile phone, they basically get addicted to playing video games or so. So there could be possibility to think about new machines or kind of create a new milieu, new environments for the babies, for example, when they play, when they have a mobile phone. So they have to create a new symbolic world, in the sense like taking care of the psychotic patients in the lab.
Yes, no, I am very much interested in this. As you said in the beginning of this colloquium, my original training is in psychology, and for some time I used to work in sort of clinical context. And one of the things that really fascinated me was the impact that technological objects could have on specific pathologies, in quotation marks. And the famous example at the time were sort of autistic children who, through the use of computers, were actually able to communicate in quite surprising ways. And that was discussed in the 1990s. And so against that background, I would like to have a closer look at thanks you for posting the link here in the chat. I will be happy to look at this. It sounds very interesting. Thank you.
So we have the last question from Andrea. Do you think the Simondon's theory of image can say something about normativity? when Simondon says that the invention of technical objects changed the biological structure and the mental images?
Yeah, it's so. To me, Simondon, to considerable degrees, is really a generalization or even an ontologization, one might perhaps say, of Gestalt psychology, right? And one of the fascinating things is his take on, creativity, or sort of the imaginary, or the invention of technological objects. And in the book on the existence of technological objects, he has, when he's discussing the gimbal turbine, he has this fascinating reflection about what it takes to invent really a new sort of technological objects. And his claim is, it's not just about the object itself, it's also about the environment that the object sort of, creates or needs the associated milieu. And this, I think, is really a striking argument, and I continue to be fascinated with it. And I would also think it applies to our ability of sort of, normative actions. Normativity cannot just be understood as a way that simply imposes individual norms on a sort of abstract environment. No, it obviously has to take into account the environment and the relation of the organism to the environment. If you want to create effective norms, it's rather obvious that it has to take into account both sides of the coin, the organism and the environment. And in that sense, yes, I would probably say that Simondon's take on the problem of invention can also help us to understand and better understand what normativity is all about. Yeah.
Right. Well, we have finished all the questions. So thank you very much, Henning. It was a great pleasure to discuss with you about Canguilhem and Deleuze, Guattari, Simondon again. And I hope there will be another chance to welcome to see each other face to face. So I want to thank you, and also thank the audience for staying with us for 2 hours. And next week, next month, we are going to have an event with Andrew Finback, a philosopher of technology, former student of Herbert Marcuse, on the 16th of March. So you can refer to our website for more information. So again, thank you, Henning, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Yuk, for inviting me to this. It was really a pleasure being here. And as you said, I very much look forward to meet you in person again at some point. Yeah. Thank you all.
Yeah. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.